Okay, guys, in this video, we're looking at Standard 4.12 African Americans in the early Republic. So, for free African Americans in the North, they had very few political rights, basically none. They were able to maintain their families. In some cases, they were able to own land, but in many cases, they actually were not able to own land. They were discriminated against by white churches, and so they had to form their own and even form the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME. They didn't have the right to vote. They faced workplace discrimination with low pay. They were often the first to be laid off, especially as cheap workforce came from immigration. And they weren't allowed to join labor unions. So they were used as strike breakers. Anytime a union did go on strike, employers would hire black workers to take their place. And this created a lot of tension between white workers and black workers. Just like the North, free blacks in the South had no political rights. Uh, they gained their freedom in various different ways. Some gained their freedom by fighting in the Revolutionary War. Some, their owners granted them their freedom. And others were able to do side jobs that they got paid for and then eventually were able to buy their own freedom. And there were dangers. It was dangerous to be a free black man or woman in the South. They were frequently kidnapped by slave traders. They had to carry paperwork to prove their freedom. And even then, many groups ignored those free papers and kidnapped them anyways. Many, however, remained in the South so that they could be near their still enslaved family. For those who were slaves in the South, there was a change in slavery over time. All right, so changes from the 18th century. Early on, most slaves were African American men born outside the United States. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have a culture that fit in with the United States. They didn't have a common culture in many cases because many of them were from different tribes. But by the 1800s, by the 19th century, most slaves were born in America. They spoke English and they started to form a common culture. Life on the plantation, most slaves worked on large plantations. There were slaves who worked in various other industries within the South, but most slaves could be found on these large plantations, in many cases growing cotton. They worked from sunup to sundown. Field slaves worked in the fields, house slaves worked in the house, and division of labor oftentimes was gender based. A lot of men were working in the fields, a lot of the women were working in the house. The cruelty of slavery was it hard to imagine. Rape was commonplace and was legal. Whippings were used for minor offenses. Body mutilation and even death used for more serious transgressions. Family members were sold as a form of punishment, not and profit. And a lot of times they called it being sold down the river. If you get out of line, I'm going to sell you to another plantation into the deep South where you'll never see your family again, or I'll sell your child. And they did. And they did. They could not own property, they could not marry, and they could not learn to read or write. There are many things that they could not do, but these are some of the things that I chose to highlight here. And of course, above all else, they were forced to work without pay. Here is a map of the domestic slave trade, the slave trade that took place within the United States, where these family members were split apart. And you could see that a lot of the uh, of those being sold were being sold further south as cotton became a bigger part of the economy of the Deep South. There was resistance. There was peaceful resistance. You saw restraint actions where slaves protested by simply working slowly. They got the reputation that there's a stereotype that slaves were lazy, but they weren't lazy. They just weren't paid, and so they were not incentivized to work hard And why would they? In a lot of cases, they tried to work as slow as possible to not benefit their masters. They also sabotaged crops and equipment. Then there was those who ran away. Slaves in border states, especially, found it easier to escape into the free North than those in the deep South. Though even there, they attempted to escape into Spanish Florida when it did belong to Spain and into Mexico. If they were caught, however, they could face severe punishments. Then there were rebellions. There were only a few large uprisings throughout American history, but Southern society was absolutely terrified of them. Uh, in Haiti, there was a slave rebellion that took over the entire island, and they won their freedom that way. So they looked at that and they thought, well, that could happen to us, especially on those plantations. They were outnumbered. And one of the more famous or infamous, depending on point of view, was that by Nat Turner. Uh, he led a slave rebellion that killed over 50 white men, women, and children in just a single day, while they attacked 5 plantations. Now, the rebellion was put down rather quickly, and all that were participated were killed, including some that did not. Uh, but this was their big fear. And so they passed things called slave codes. These were laws to keep slaves from revolting. And what they did is they restricted them even further than they were already restricted. Things like the bans on being able to read and write, bans against preaching, and their ability to move from place to place, and other such things. To try, their plan was to prevent future rebellions, to restrict them even further. Okay, guys, that's it for this video.